Before we continue, take a moment to like this video if you appreciate true stories of courage and humanity. Subscribe to the channel for more cinematic history documentaries like this one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your support helps these forgotten stories reach the world. The winter of 1944 was unforgiving. Across Europe, the war had reached a breaking point, and the cold was as deadly as any weapon. Snow buried forests, roads vanished beneath ice, and survival depended on discipline, timing, and trust. In the hills near the German border, a small unit of American soldiers was assigned what seemed like a routine mission: hold a strategic position, observe enemy movement, and prevent breakthroughs. The map showed no mercy. Thick woods, limited visibility, no easy retreat. Among them was a forward observer, a soldier trained not to fight with a rifle, but with coordinates and calm judgment. His job was to see what others could not and speak clearly when chaos ruled. He was not the highest-ranking man, nor the strongest. But when artillery was needed, his voice carried more weight than any weapon. As dawn broke through the fog, the unit realized something was wrong. Movement appeared in the tree line, then more, then too many to count. German forces, hundreds of them, were advancing from multiple directions. This was not a patrol. This was an encirclement. Orders came fast. Confusion followed faster. One by one, American soldiers were wounded, pinned down, or forced to fall back. Communications failed. Ammunition ran low. The forest that once offered cover now trapped them like a closing fist. Within hours, the position collapsed. Only one man remained. The forward observer was wounded, bleeding from multiple injuries. His rifle was nearly useless. His unit was gone. Some captured, some fallen, some escaped into the snow. And still, the enemy advanced. German soldiers surrounded the position, cautiously at first, then with confidence. They expected surrender. After all, one man could not stop an army. But this was not just one man. Lying in the snow, barely able to stand, the observer reached for his radio, the lifeline to artillery units miles away. His hands shook from blood loss and cold. Every breath hurt. The signal was weak, but it was enough. On the other end, an American artillery officer answered. The observer reported his situation calmly. Enemy forces, close range. Completely surrounded. The response was immediate and firm. Adjust fire, get out of there. But there was nowhere to go. The observer looked around. German soldiers were close enough now that he could hear their voices. He knew what capture would mean, not just for him, but for nearby civilians and retreating Allied troops who could be exposed if this position fell cleanly. He made a decision that defied instinct. He gave the coordinates. They were wrong. Deliberately wrong, the artillery officer hesitated. The numbers placed the strike dangerously close. "Those coordinates are on your position," the voice said. The observer paused for only a moment. "Correct it," he replied. "Fire for effect." This was not recklessness, it was precision. He understood the pattern of artillery. He knew how close it could land. He calculated risk not for himself, but for everyone else. Shells began to fall. The forest erupted. Snow, earth, and smoke filled the air. German soldiers scattered, shocked by the sudden barrage. What they thought was a simple capture turned into chaos. From his position, the observer continued to guide the fire. Calm, clear, professional. Each correction pushed the enemy farther back. He was no longer fighting for survival alone. He was buying time. Time for civilians to flee. Time for Allied units to regroup. Time for history to remember that courage is not always loud. It is often steady, measured, and selfless. As the barrage continued, the observer faded in and out of consciousness. His radio slipped from his hand. Snow covered his uniform. Silence followed the thunder. When the smoke cleared, the forest stood broken. But the enemy advance was stopped. What happened next would shock both sides of the war. When the artillery finally stopped, the forest felt unreal. Smoke drifted between shattered trees. Snow fell again, soft and quiet, covering the scars left behind. What moments earlier had been chaos now stood frozen in uneasy calm. German soldiers emerged cautiously from cover. They expected to find destruction. They expected to find bodies. What they did not expect was silence, and one wounded man lying alone in the snow. The forward observer was barely conscious. His uniform was torn. Blood darkened the white ground beneath him. The radio lay beside his frozen hand. A German officer approached carefully, weapon lowered. He had seen many battlefields, many acts of desperation, but nothing like this. They searched the position. There was no American unit, no defensive line, just one man. And then they realized the truth. The artillery fire they had endured, the fire that broke their advance, had been guided by this soldier. Alone, surrounded, wounded. The German officer looked down at him with disbelief. In war, courage was respected even among enemies. And this was beyond courage. Orders were given quickly. Medics were called, not to interrogate, not to punish, but to save his life. Against all expectations, the enemy carried him away from the battlefield. Not as a prisoner dragged in defeat, but as a wounded soldier treated with professionalism and respect. As he regained consciousness, the observer realized he was alive. German medics worked to stop the bleeding. Bandages were applied, water was given. No one struck him, no one shouted. Instead, there was quiet efficiency. An officer spoke through a translator. "You called fire on yourself," he said. "Why?" The observer's answer was simple. "They were coming through. I had to stop them." No speeches, no dramatic explanation. Just duty. Word spread quickly through the German ranks. Soldiers whispered about the American who had chosen death over surrender. Not to kill indiscriminately, but to halt an advance that would cost many lives on both sides. Later, as Allied forces pushed forward days afterward, German units withdrew from the area. But they did not leave without making a decision that shocked everyone involved. The wounded American was not sent to a distant prison camp. Instead, under a white flag, he was returned to American lines. German officers personally ensured his evacuation. Before leaving, one of them reportedly spoke words that would echo long after the war. "You fought like a soldier," he said. "We had no right to kill you." Back among Allied forces, the observer's actions were initially difficult to understand. Reports came in, coordinates were reviewed. Artillery logs confirmed what seemed impossible. He had intentionally adjusted fire onto his own position. Commanders realized the impact of that decision. The enemy advance had been halted. Key terrain remained uncontested. Nearby villages avoided occupation. Allied units regrouped safely and stabilized the line. Lives, countless lives, had been spared. As news traveled up the chain of command, the story grew heavier with each retelling. Not because it was exaggerated, but because it was precise. Every detail confirmed the same truth. This was not reckless bravery. This was calculated sacrifice. The observer survived his wounds after months of recovery. He never spoke dramatically about the incident. To him, it was not a legend. It was a moment where training, responsibility, and conscience met under impossible pressure. Years later, military historians would point to this act as one of the most extraordinary examples of battlefield judgment ever recorded. Not because of how many enemies were defeated, but because of how many lives were protected. In time, official recognition followed. Medals were awarded, citations were written. His name entered history, not as a man who sought death, but as a man who accepted its possibility for something greater than himself. Yet perhaps the most powerful recognition never came from his own side. It came from the enemy, from soldiers who saw what happened and chose respect over revenge, from officers who understood that honor does not wear one uniform alone. On that frozen battlefield, surrounded by 600 enemies, one man proved that humanity could survive even the darkest hours of war. And the choice he made, quiet, deliberate, and selfless, would outlive the sound of artillery forever. Winter loosened its grip slowly, leaving behind forests scarred by ice, snow, and the echoes of battle. But even as Europe prepared for another harsh season, the story of the lone observer began to travel. Soldiers shared it in hushed voices at mess halls, medics whispered it in field hospitals, and officers recounted it during strategy meetings. He had survived against impossible odds, yet the story was never about his survival. It was about what one person could do when duty, courage, and conscience intersected. In the weeks following the encounter, Allied forces discovered villages untouched, civilians spared, and soldiers who had retreated through enemy lines now safe. Many historians argue that the decision to call artillery on his own position altered the course of engagements in that region. One man, acting with calculated risk, had saved hundreds. The observer himself recovered in a field hospital, surrounded by comrades and the faint warmth of a radiator that seemed miraculous after weeks in sub-zero conditions. He reflected on the moment. There had been fear, certainly. Cold, pain, and uncertainty had threatened to overwhelm him. But in the end, he relied on his training, his clarity of thought, and the knowledge that every choice carried consequence. Even decades later, he would recall the sound of artillery shells as both terrifying and strangely purposeful. Each explosion was a heartbeat in the rhythm of war, a measure of life and death that he had momentarily controlled. News of his actions eventually reached higher command. A formal commendation was issued, highlighting not only bravery but strategic brilliance, yet he remained humble. In interviews, he often shifted praise to the unit he had lost, to the soldiers whose courage had inspired him, and to the unseen lives preserved by his choice. It wasn't just military historians who took notice. Civilian newspapers later recounted the story as an emblem of humanity in war. Editorials praised the moral clarity it represented, the idea that even in conflict, one could act to protect life rather than merely destroy it. But perhaps the most remarkable acknowledgement came from letters sent years later. Former German soldiers, now civilians, wrote to express respect and gratitude. They recounted the story of the American who had faced certain death without hesitation, whose choices showed an understanding of life that transcended national boundaries. Many described the moment as the ultimate act of soldierly honor, a rare instance of respect bridging the gap between enemies. As the observer aged, he often reflected on the paradox of that day. How destruction could coexist with preservation, how fear could coexist with courage, and how one man's decision could ripple outward, touching lives he would never meet. He continued to emphasize that heroism isn't measured in medals, but in the consequences of deliberate choices. In military academies, his actions became part of case studies on battlefield ethics, decision-making under pressure, and moral courage. Students learned that leadership is not only about command, but about responsibility, and that sometimes the right action is the one that carries personal risk for the greater good. On the anniversary of the battle, veterans returned to the site. Snow covered much of the ground where artillery had fallen, but remnants remained. Shattered trees, mounds of earth, and the quiet testimony of history. They placed wreaths and markers, not for victory in combat, but in honor of an act that had preserved countless lives. Even now, the story resonates. It is told not to glorify war, but to illuminate the human capacity for selflessness and judgment in extreme circumstances. One man's courage reminds us that heroism does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a radio call, calculated yet unyielding, measured yet profound. The frozen forest may have healed, but the legacy endured. A single soldier, surrounded by 600 enemies, had chosen the impossible, to risk everything for the sake of others. And in doing so, he left behind a timeless lesson, that true bravery is measured not by the victories you claim, but by the lives you protect. The forest had returned to a quiet stillness, but the echoes of that day lingered in the hearts of all who knew the story. In the years after the war, historians, veterans, and civilians alike revisited the event, trying to understand the extraordinary decision of the lone forward observer who had called artillery on himself. For the soldier, the moment remained vivid, etched into memory like frost on a window pane. He remembered the cold biting at his face, the deafening roar of shells, the shouts of soldiers, and the fleeting fear that he might not survive. And yet, amid the chaos, there had been clarity. Every calculation, every decision, every transmitted coordinate was a thread in a tapestry of life and survival. In Allied command, the story was studied with fascination. Officers examined the logs of artillery fire, cross-referenced them with troop movements, and calculated the lives saved. The results were staggering. Hundreds of soldiers had survived the day because of his choice. Entire villages had avoided the devastation of occupation. Retreating units had been able to reorganize and resist future attacks. What began as a single act of courage had multiplied into consequences that shaped the battlefield itself. Recognition followed cautiously. Because the act bordered on recklessness, it required both bravery and precise judgment. Medal citations noted the paradox. He had endangered himself to save others, calculated risk with extraordinary skill, and displayed moral courage under extreme pressure. The observer himself never sought accolades. For him, heroism was not in the awards or the stories, but in knowing that lives were spared through his decisions. But perhaps the most remarkable impact was the respect it earned from the enemy. German soldiers who survived that engagement never forgot it. They recounted to their grandchildren the story of an American who chose to risk his life to protect both sides from unnecessary bloodshed. In letters written decades later, they expressed admiration and gratitude. One former officer wrote, "In the worst hours of war, he reminded us that honor and humanity can exist even amid destruction." The story crossed generations. Military academies analyzed the incident as a lesson in ethics, courage, and responsibility. Students learned that battlefield heroism is not always about killing the enemy or claiming territory. It can be about protecting the vulnerable, making calculated choices, and accepting personal risk for the greater good. For civilians, the tale became symbolic. Newspapers and documentaries highlighted the moral dimension of war, that even in the darkest moments, individuals could act with integrity. The forward observer became a quiet emblem of the human capacity for selflessness. His story was retold in classrooms, museums, and public forums, inspiring those who studied it to reflect on the power of individual choice. As the observer aged, he remained humble. He rarely spoke publicly, and when he did, he emphasized the collective courage of all soldiers, both allies and enemies. "I only did what I had to," he would say. The real heroes are those who fight, suffer, and survive every day, even without recognition. On the battlefield itself, nature slowly reclaimed the land. Trees grew back, snow fell anew each winter, and the scars of artillery faded. Yet, in the hearts and minds of those who knew the story, the site remained sacred. Veterans returned to honor the memory of courage and sacrifice, leaving markers not for victory, but for humanity. The final lesson endures. Heroism is not the absence of fear, nor the pursuit of glory. It is the willingness to act when every choice carries consequence, when every decision might cost your life. It is the courage to stand alone, surrounded by danger, and make a choice that protects others, even at great personal risk. 600 enemies surrounded him. Death lingered close, artillery rained down. Yet in that frozen forest, humanity triumphed. Lives were spared, respect was earned, and a single act of bravery left a mark on history that time cannot erase. This is the story of the forward observer who, against all odds, became a guardian of life in a world defined by war. A story that reminds us that courage is not measured by weapons or numbers, but by the willingness to do what is right, even when the price is everything. And as long as that forest, those villages, and those stories exist, his legacy will endure, a testament to the power of selflessness, integrity, and the human spirit.